Welcome to our last webinar of this year, OpenEdge 2024 retrospective and an outlook for 2025. Peter and I have been thinking about what we could be doing as a final webinar of the year, and well, we thought, well, let's review what happened during the passing year. Some things that we've observed in our customer projects. Together with highlights from some of the presentations that we've done over the year, where there was huge interest, and well, then close this webinar with what we think might be coming to OpenEdge developers next year. Quite opinionated, but well, this is our webinar. Good, and with that, I would get started. Start with a quick introduction of myself, and then I'll hand it over to Peter. My name is Mike Fechner. I founded Consultingwerk, and I'm both running the business, but I'm also involved in technical roles, both in our customer projects, supporting our customers as an architect during modernization projects, and responsible for the development of our products like the Smart Component Library and the WinKit. I like to spend my time coding as well, so perfect day for me is one where I at least get half of the time of the day coding, which is rarely enough. I think I've specialized on object-oriented design, especially in the ABL architecture, and the two UI technology that we are working with, Windows Desktop and web, not really a mobile developer. Started using Progress 34 years ago with version 5, and ever since then been working with the most recent ones. With that, I'll pass it over to Peter, because we've quite a few slides to go.
Excuse me. Yeah, I'm Peter Judge. I'm I guess architect at Consultingwerk. I work more on the coding side. I'm lucky that way. I don't get to do much of the business, so I'm grateful for that. But some development of the framework, some development on customer site, some mentoring, some architecture. I'm a newbie in a sense. Well, in the 4GL world, ABL world, I haven't hit 30 years yet, but still, still love it, still learning, still working with it wherever I can. I was at Progress for almost 20 years. Now I am free or escaped for a couple of years at Consultingwerk. Mike still blames me for everything that goes wrong at Progress, on a good day. But yeah, I mainly work as I said, on ABL coding frameworks, integration stuff. PASOE is I suppose a favorite of mine. HTTP stuff, integration stuff. It's a nice broad thing. Yeah, I'll hand it back to you, Mike.
Good. Well, and we at Consultingwerk, a team of 17 people in various countries, mostly in Europe and in the States, referred to us as an independent IT organization, IT consulting organization, but mostly focusing on OpenEdge and related technology, and working with customers almost all around the world. We haven't any customer in Asia yet, but well, future will show. And we're providing consulting service to our customers and our vendor of developer tools like the Smart Component Library. Well, we use our expertise in various areas like GUI for .NET, Angular, object orientation, software architecture in many OpenEdge application modernization projects. Good. Well, let's start with a look back at what happened throughout 2024. And let's first review some of the conferences that we've been involved in. There were PAC Progress User Group conferences all over Europe, in Germany, in Tallinn for the Baltic region. In Germany, we conducted a workshop together with Jill Carrot on using VS Code for OpenEdge developers, which I think was quite successful. I mean, it was a very, very hot day, that 6th of June. And yeah, week later, there was a UK and Ireland PAC meeting in Birmingham. Then over the summer, there was kind of like a break in the PAC. It's typically always the spring is full with these smaller PAC conferences. And then the fall is dominated by the PUC Challenge conferences. This year, the PUC Challenge in Prague and the one in Boston have been organized closely together by mostly the same team, with also a huge overlap in speakers. The one in Prague was in, more mid-September. The one in Boston was end of September into beginning of October. When we planned those dates at the beginning of the year, it felt like a very good idea to have those both conferences just like one after the other, with just a week in between to get some fresh air. And well, you still know your presentations. At the end of this 3-week challenge sprint, I don't think that anybody felt that was a great idea. So looking forward that next year there'll be a couple more weeks in between. Well, and then conference-wise, the Dutch PAC, PAC Netherlands, has concluded the series of conferences with their meeting, an afternoon meeting, half a day in Utrecht on the 14th of November. For the Smart Component Live, it was also quite a vibrant year. I counted this morning, we had 25 releases so far. And there will be at least one more release to come, maybe even two. We've onboarded new customers, and we're also looking at onboarding further new customers onto the framework in the first couple months of next year. So it's definitely looking quite promising for the Smart Component Library and even more adoption of the Smart Component Library. Looking back at what we did in the development, we have continued our move to even stronger looking into the repository-based user interface options. When we started with the framework, we strongly integrated with the Progress OpenEdge GUI for .NET Visual Designer. And well, for various reasons, I'm quite happy that now, we are with our repository fully in a position that we do no longer need the Progress developers to do Visual Designer for anything. And the two main reasons is it makes us independent from the Progress Developer Studio. There's more to come on that area further in this webinar. And the other is that, well, this brings us in a position where we can have our UI design tooling, which is actually technology independent for different kind of UI technologies. And we use it ourselves for our Angular web UI and our desktop UI. And we have partners like Build One that use our UI repository and the tooling around that for their own web user interface. So it has proven to be quite a flexible tooling there. One thing that I think we started at the end of 2023, but really put a lot of development effort in the first half of 2024 is server-side event handling. I myself must admit that I always thought UI event handling needs to be coded on the UI, needs to be coded in the native language of the UI that you're using. And therefore, I've been a little bit hesitant to add server-side event handling as a feature in the product, but I have been convinced that it is very useful. It enables ABL developers to do UI event handling also for web applications, which is very, very powerful. And it also enables us to be more future-proof in terms of writing event handling code once and using it in the future in whatever UI technology will be coming. A set of features that we've also spent a lot of development time this year on is what I would refer to as API-first tooling. APIs here typically being REST APIs that you either want to consume or expose, and by using an API definition, typically OpenAPI or Swagger, and generating code that exposes those APIs or consumes these APIs. We make it very, very easy to build applications in that space. So, what are key trends that we've seen in or drivers in the OpenEdge world this year? Well, one thing that I think has pushed many OpenEdge users into thinking about any form of modernization is a nearby retirement of OpenEdge 11.7. Together with the availability of OpenEdge 12.8, I think OpenEdge 12.8 was released formally end of 23, but really became available then, or most people started using it throughout this year. We've seen a lot of adoption of VS Code and how and what and why, something that Peter will be talking about here. Together with that, we've seen a strong push towards migrating to PaaS-OE. I mean, it's a necessity if you've been using the classic app server and now more or less voluntarily move towards OpenEdge 12, you have to get into PaaS-OE because the classic app server is no longer there. With that classic app server, or with that migration to PaaS-OE, we see a strong interest in various authentication methods, OS2, SAML, etc., which especially kept Peter quite busy over the year. Yeah, and like I mentioned earlier, the API development. Yeah, so as a matter of fact, unless Progress changes that plan, which I do not expect coming, OpenEdge 11.7 will retire on April 1st next year. Whether or not Progress really wants to make anybody who keeps on using 11.7 after April 1st look like an April's fool, I don't know, but it is the date. What we see is that most customers are on a strategy to upgrade to OE 12. Many have finished that already, but those which are still on 11.7 today are on their way. And well, typically development is completed or in a way, and there's a plan for releasing OpenEdge 12 in customer environments or production environments already there. We see some customers are relatively relaxed with the April 1st, and they say if they finish it in the first half of the year, that's okay. And other customers are really eager to get it done before April 1st. And yeah, like I said, the migration from 11.7 to 12 is driving PaaS-OE adoption as well. When it comes to migrating to OpenEdge 12, a decision that customers have to do, and we are very often asked for support there and finding the right answer is, well, go to 12.2 or 12.8. And I think in short, we believe that both versions are equally stable in productions. So from a stability point of view, somebody who says, yeah, but 12.2 is around for so much longer, and 12.2 already has, I don't know, 17 service packs, and 12.8 only has 4 service packs. Doesn't that mean that 12.2 is more robust, more stable? I just don't think so. I mean, there will be known issues in both versions, but overall, as I would say, go into 12.8. 12.8 will be the longer lasting LTS release. With 12.2, you'll have to upgrade to the next LTS in 3 years. With 12.8, you'll have a couple more years before you have to make the next move. There's only one reason that makes this decision hard, and this is really something to not underestimate, and that is the state of Progress Developer Studio. If you have to maintain a large code base, especially a large code base with OO code, then 12.8 may be very problematic. I once said, if a customer comes to me and asks me, go to 12.2 or 12.8, I would so say, go to 12.8 unless I'm the poor idiot that has to support you with Progress Developer Studio. And I have to say that's that drastic. I mean, I've given to all our colleagues release instruction that if you want to code in Progress Developer Studio, if you want to continue coding Progress Developer Studio, you need my explicit approval for that on a case-by-case basis, because for me, 12.8 Progress Developer Studio is just a productivity blocker, and the development environment should actually be enhancing the productivity of a developer. So unfortunately, we cannot use a 12.2 Prox Developer Studio with a 12.8 runtime. And the key issue in Prox Developer Studio there is really the performance of everything around this initialized OpenEdge tooling and scanning the source code and those things. Somewhere, and I don't really remember whether 12.5 or 12.6 was the version. Prox has changed the implementation there, and performance dropped to the point that when there are bigger changes in my code base, like switching from one branch to the other, my laptop, which I think isn't a slow machine, will become unresponsive for almost an hour. And the only thing that I can use that laptop for during that time is boiling eggs, because it is really producing lots of hot air. So the rescue to that is VS Code, and we are seeing, not only because of the problems with the performance of Prox Developer Studio, but also with functionality, and just because it is the hot trend and every developer goes to VS Code, a huge demand to go to VS Code for ABL development. We've supported many of our customers during that move by setting up the workspace, by teaching them how to do that. I personally would say that sometime in the second quarter of this year, the Visual Studio Code extension for OpenEdge, maintained by Riverside, was ready for prime time, meaning that I think it had the quality and maturity and the feature completeness that it should be good for everybody writing code in the ABL, and not just for the early adopters. Peter Judge started using it. I don't know, when did you, I think mid last year already, you started using it as your main tooling vehicle. I have been using it every now and then in the second half of last year, and I think since January this year, it was my main development environment, which was certainly also driven by the fact that I realized that 12.8 didn't fix the performance issues in Developer Studio. And since then, most of our team has been using it every day for their coding. So, Peter, do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. I will. Thank you. I'll ask you to click through then. So as Mike said, Visual Studio Code I started using daily, almost daily, about a year and a bit ago, maybe a year and a half ago. And it took some getting used to, as all new tools do, but it's really, really quite nice once you're used to it. Visual Studio Code is a free as in beer, free as in code, open source code editor. They don't call it an IDE. They're very careful not to call themselves an IDE, even though it's kind of like duck typing. If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, the odds are fairly good that it's a duck. So in IDE terms.
Well, but Peter, you know that Microsoft is still trying to make money with an IDE, which lives besides of VS Code. So
yes, that's fair enough. Yes. So it's I believe Atom based. It's based on TypeScript, JavaScript code. It's a real. I think the main functionality is fairly small, and everything is extended through extensions. There's kind of core extensions, and then there's user extensions that you install as a user. Central repository to do that. There are some alternate repositories. You can sideband install stuff. So if you want to beta test stuff for people, and I'll talk about extensions in a sec. First class support for SCM tools. So Git is very much a first class citizen. Force is there. Other source control systems, I don't know. I've not dared go look and see if CVS or Subversion are in there, but really good support for that, and almost to the point that if you're asked at a customer to install one tool, Visual Studio Code is probably the best one to ask for. It's a great text editor, it's fast, it's got good Git support, all those sort of things.
I always refer to it as my emergency Git client. when I'm at a customer, because you can install it as a user installation, so you don't need to be administrator to install it. You just
Right.
drop in the installer through the RDP session and can install it just for yourself there, and it's really cool, yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, like Peter mentioned, it really scales up from being like the default editor for every little change in an I file to maintaining progress OpenEdge code bases with a couple of 10,000 files. Really impressive.
Yeah. And kind of in that vein as well, if you do install it, the settings is complicated enough or complex enough to support multiple configurations, but it's really nice in the sense that you can log in to a Microsoft account, whether it's, I'm not entirely sure where they move all of this stuff, but you can share your settings and your extensions across all of your installations. So for, certainly in our world where we have multiple installs, multiple machines we're working on, having your standard, your own set of settings across those machines is great. Having it available on Linux and on Windows, and also that other operating system that Progress doesn't support, is also very nice. So, you can do direct on Linux development, which is something that unfortunately, well, at one point I believe it was a beta for Progress Developer Studio, and that was removed. So I know there's, still tons of code bases, tons of people working on Linux-based systems. You can use, an install on that machine, or you can remote in using SSH or WSL or Docker. There's kind of tunneling in. That works really well, and I'm only smiling because there's a couple of cases where it doesn't work. There's some SSH things that don't always work great.
Slides have been moved to later. Okay, so after this was the sample coming with the SSH into Linux box. Okay.
Yeah, it's in a couple of slides time. And that's really nifty as well. If you just want to work from your machine, just as long as you can make an SSH connection onto that Linux box, you can go and look at stuff.
Before we move to the next slide, there was a question from Peter van Dam, whether we are expecting Progress to fix the Progress Developer Studio problems in 12.8. Well, I was, since those problems were there in 12.5, 12.6, 12.7, 12.8, I have given up hope, and I will only change my mind while I see results. There recently was a knowledge base article that says that these issues are to be fixed in 12.8.5, but the wording there wasn't exactly the issues that I faced. So again, I'm just waiting. Carl, was that a raise sign of? Did you raise your hand?
Carl Verbeest, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as for PDSOE is concerned, we have some preliminary promises for 12.8.6.
Okay.
So,
Which is
and
mid next
a
year.
little bit in 5, but not much.
Yeah, well, which is mid next year. So
Yes.
I hold my breath. Okay.
So do I. Okay, I'll leave you.
Thank you.
Just the last thing on that other one, the other really important thing that came out of Visual Studio Code, Microsoft's release, was this concept of a language server. And that opens a whole world of possibilities in terms of basically extensions for languages into Visual Studio Code. And that is what the ABL extension does, or uses the technology it uses to provide not syntax highlighting necessarily, but code completion, compilation, those kinds of things, outline views, all sorts of things. And so, basically we can do almost everything in Visual Studio Code that you can in Progress Developer Studio. The big exception here is visual editing. There is a means to call the app builder develop, but not the GUI4.net design surface or canvas or designer. Config is through JSON files. They are right there in the folder. It's really nice. They're not hidden in dot folders where you have to go and scratch around and see what's going on. Makes it really nice for sharing your configuration with your colleagues, with other people in your organization. You just check them into the source control, they just check them out, and voila, magic happens. It's not magic, but it happens. It's, once you set up, it's really easy to propagate through a whole bunch of things. You can configure how fast you want it to go, in the sense of, if you have a big machine, you have lots of CPU, you have lots of memory available, you can say, I want to compile 10 threads concurrently, and that makes your 20,000 file compile go from an hour down to Mike, 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, something like that. We can compile the whole smart component library pretty quickly with configuration. Yeah, it's debugger support built into PDSOE. Sorry, oh, that was bad. Into Visual Studio Code. Yeah. You can get to the dictionary. You can run stuff in terms of running programs inline. This is the extension. I've got it here because there's a number of ABL extensions. I think it's a little bit like Gradle's repo, where you can add stuff. It's like Hotel California. You can check in, but you can never leave. So all of the predecessors of this plugin, of this extension, are still in the VS Code repository. This is the one you want. Make sure it says Riverside. The logo is fairly easy to recognize, and we're up to 1.16, as Mike, I believe, mentioned. The extension is under active development. There's releases in the pre-release branch, maybe twice a month, and full releases every couple of months. So it turns over pretty quickly. Yeah. So to go from, as I mentioned, from Windows to Linux, just from some screenshots, you have that little green icon on the bottom. You connect. You can configure an SSH host with your credentials, and voila, you connect. This works most of the time. You connect where you want, the folders you want to go to on that remote host, and then you edit like your local. And Visual Studio Code deals with all of the communication and installing whatever it needs to on that remote machine, and it's all pretty nifty. You can avoid the map drive hell. Yeah.
And I mean, some other text editors, what they do under the hood is they FTP or SSH into another machine and copy the files to a local temp directory, and you can edit them locally, and when you save, they'll be uploaded again. Here, really, the core editor runtime is actually running on Linux, and you're just seeing a front end on Windows. It's a bit like X Windows. So the program's runtime that would compile and run your code is sitting on that Linux box and not on your Windows box. So that's quite cool. So even I can do Linux development that way.
Yes.
Or I want to.
Indeed. As I kind of touched on, extensions are what makes this whole thing magic and work. The main one you're going to want is the ABL extension by Riverside. That provides you with a whole bunch of functionality. Carl Verbeest, who is here, has put together a meta pack, which is kind of nifty, for a whole bunch of different extensions. The ABL unit one is really useful, and Mike's been using for a little longer than I have, but I've started to come to it, and it's really nice integrated into the IDE. You can kind of inline see which of your tests have failed, which have passed, run them straight from the program. So there's not a shortcut you have to run. You just click a little green arrow and run the test, and it runs, or it fails, or whatever it does, it does. So really nice for that iterative test-driven development cycle. And that's come on in leaps and bounds as well. Also, in the last 3 months or so, I suppose since 3 to 6 months, become really, really useful, really usable in terms of the developing environment.
Yeah, the
There's
coolest features really the coolest thing about the ABL unit test runners is really the indication of test coverage. So within the development environment, it colors your lines of code whether or not they've been run during your unit test. So if you really want to get a good coverage of the unit test, so that you make sure that almost all of the passes your code can do are covered by unit tests, you see that in the editor, so you can't get it any closer to your fingers.
Yep, exactly. Baltic Amadeus are producing, I've got a couple of public ones. ProPeak is a profiler output one. There's a database viewer. I know they're working on a formatter. So that's kind of one of the, well, not necessarily gotchas, but one of the differences between PDSOE and Visual Studio Code. A lot of stuff, some things, the formatting things are kind of provided by separate plugins rather than by one kind of monolithic plugin. So if you look in the Java world or in the JSON world or the XML world, there's multiple formatters that you can pick and choose to do what you want to. So I know Baltic and Amadeus are working on a formatting plugin, which is going to be really interesting. So now lint again plugs in. So you see the blue squigglies along with the red squigglies. When you have compile failures, you get the red ones. When you have lint failures, you get the blue squigglies. All very visual. So these are kind of the core ABL extensions that I think are useful. And others, spell checker. I never realized how badly I could write English until I ran the spell checker on the code I write. And it's like, oh, okay, that's a typo. That's a typo. Just, it's somewhat cosmetic, but it just is nice. A bunch of other things for talking to Jenkins build service. So from your IDE now, you can see what your builds look like, what the success and failure rate are like. You can read the log files, that sort of stuff. Indent Rainbow is kind of nice. Yes, it's just cosmetic, but helps you with lining up your indentations pretty nicely. And again, there's a bunch of other stuff. The file templates is important because you can set up new files to be like you want, right? So we always include using consultingwerk.star from ProPath. We always include a certain include file. We have certain structures. We always want the default constructor, for instance, to be there with a comment. And so you can build these templates fairly easily. They're not as complex as the JET templates that PDSOE provide, but they're pretty neat to add whatever functionality you want to add in. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, and well, following Peter, I mean, there will be a recording available of Peter's talk on Visual Studio Code that was given at the PAC Challenges, hopefully for Christmas. I've given kind of like a follow-up presentation at the conference on modern OpenEdge developers tool stack, which covers like an overview of other tools. Well, I'm not going to go through all of these slides there, but I think the tool stack for modern OpenEdge developers is more diverse than just an IDE. An IDE is typically for writing code and making sure that it compiles, etc. But there's more. And one thing that is getting more and more asked for is the topic of AI support for developers, generative AI. Well, Gen AI is the kind of artificial intelligence that's capable of generating data, text, images, videos, or whatever. Can be used for good and bad, of course. These models learn patterns and are generally being trained to make decisions to support us based on what we just recently did. Probably the most likely thing we want to do next is that and that and that. So for a developer that can provide you support while coding, and for many things, I think this is the new version of wizards. And making code proposals that go beyond you start with a database table and a period, and then it gives you a list of fields, or you have a object reference colon, and what are the methods and what are the parameters there. It can propose you blocks of codes, and it's generally very rewarding when you name your coding constructs better. So long, meaningful variable names, long, meaningful procedure or method names, because based on that, it can guess your intent of what you want to do, and suggest you what comes next. these models, they learn, or they understand context, like which programming languages, frameworks you're doing, which gateway schema. To some of these Gen AI tools, you can upload documents, technical documentation, or gateway schema files, etc., to speed up the learning of stuff. The tool that I started using in the spring is Codium. Why I've picked that and not others, like maybe GitHub's Copilot or whatever. Well, I read an article, and that also compared the consequences for intellectual property between the different tools. And Codium says they guarantee that it only trains the model based on source code that is really public domain and my own source code, and that the model that is being trained based on my source code is not used to support other developers. Bluntly said, I don't want to train an AI to make my competitors better. And I think that's besides the capability of such a tool, the legal standpoint, the intellectual property standpoint, that your intellectual property is not abused, and that you're not using anybody else's intellectual property. I think it's also a very, very important thing. So I started using that. Like all of them, none of them was trained out of the box to understand ABL. But after a few days of using that, I realized that that isn't so relevant. I mean, every now and then it has bad days, and makes, especially when I edit ugly spaghetti code, procedural code, then sometimes it thinks, oh, this context looks like COBOL or whatever, and the proposals look more like COBOL than ABL. And when I'm working in a world of nicely structured OO-ABL code, then first with most OO languages, the keywords of the language aren't that relevant anymore, because you're working with an OO framework like the Smart Component Library, and it learns that, and I think it's generally better trained to work with this. And now that we're using this for, well, almost 9 months, it's definitely something that I do not want to miss. Just some quick samples there. One of the things that learned very, very soon is based on the prefixes I give to variable names, which data type it is. So whenever I define a variable I, whatever, it will nicely indent the S integer no undo. So the gray text there is the proposal, which if I would hit the tab key now, it would adopt. DE is our prefix for decimals, and so on. So here I named a method process order. While I type process order, it was already proposing then the PI order num as the input parameter. And then I just let it going, and then the first variable that it defines, I don't even have to propose the name. It just thinks, okay, it probably is going to be an instance of our ORM mapper for the order table, orders, order date set model. Then it was newing that, adding the line that filters to that order, and when I started, if not available, then it understood, okay, well, that's probably gonna be code that throws an error that the order is not found, and stuff like that. So it's helping me there. Whether I want to provide a better wording for the error message later, and I make some changes to it, like instead of throwing the app error, throwing in our exception class or so. That has in details, but it really helps with a lot of stuff. Then when I start with no customer, it knows what to do with the customer, and it there was assuming that there's probably a field customer ID. There's no customer ID in the sports database, so by that time it hasn't learned that yet. If I would do that now, after 9 months of using it, it will certainly know that the field that joins customer to order is custom and not customer ID. So, and the same with the error message. This here was from a refactoring exercise that actually blew my mind, and I literally almost fell off my chair. That was old code we had. It was writing messages to the log file in an API that uses JSON files to propagate static properties in this session. And you may see that there are 3 blocks here dealing with the different numeric types that in JSON always are number. So integer and 64 and decimal. And if you pay close attention, more attention than the developer who initially wrote this code and the developer who reviewed that code, the last message being written refers to the integer type, but everything around that is the decimal type. So it's obviously in a log message. Nobody cares really about it, but it is a typo. So, and I started replacing the direct output to the log manager with our API, which allows us to turn on and off the messages. And while I was getting to the third one, it did not just do an intelligent search and replace. It did guess that the last log message must be referring to decimal and not integer. So it's really understanding the code. And I would say this is a mix between really ABL, which is feature heavy, and referring to APIs of the framework. And this was like, I don't know, after 2 weeks of using Codium. So it's pretty cool, especially when you do stuff that in a very similar type you've done before. Good, Peter, back to you.
Yeah, so one of the things we talked a little bit about, again, there was an earlier webinar on this, is kind of what was great in 12.8, and in the AVL side in particular. So this kind of talks a little bit about the features in 12.8, not necessarily in that release, but kind of between 12.2 LTS and the 12.8 LTS. Kind of there's 3 big things that are really nice, that I think will make life significantly easier for AVL developers. First is the simplified var statement. There's a bunch of new operators we'll touch on in a sec. Generic collections, and that kind of leads us a little bit into our futures. And then also dynamic import and output, import and export. Yeah. So the var statement is syntactic sugar for the defined variable. In the R code, nothing's changed. But there are some extra rules. So it's always no undo. Progress couldn't change that given how much code there is, given 40 years of ABL code and 4GL code. But the var statement is great because it is always no undo. You don't have to think about it. It forces, and this is just my convention personally, but also most of the coding conventions, I think forces the variable definitions to be at the top of a block. I really get twitchy when I see them scattered throughout code. It really hurts my OCD or whatever it is. Makes them be at the top of a block. Is really nice. And they can be in classes. The other thing is there is data type names cannot be abbreviated. We'll get onto that in the next slide. So you can't say var, dat, d, whatever for date. And you can provide an initial value, which is real magic. Each variable can have its own. You can string them together, like that bottom example. You can use the word char and you can use the word int there, and they are synonyms, not abbreviations. I do not understand that thread that was needled, but yeah. The other great thing about them is that you can use them for classes. So you can initialize, you can say var Consultingwerk dot a data set model, for instance, give it a variable name equals, and give the new statement right there in line, which is really more aligned with a lot of other languages. Kind of nifty. Yep. So the next big thing is operator changes. This is called the safe navigation operator. And if you've got nested chains of objects, and as you go further and further into the OO world, you're going to have objects with references to other objects, and they're going to refer to other objects, and they're going to refer to other objects. And as a defensive programmer, you need to make sure that you don't get that lovely 168 error message at runtime, right? Because there's an invalid object there. So you either make a lot of assumptions, which is bad, or you write a lot of code for if valid object, then if valid object, and then your code just bloats.
And just to be clear, when Peter here refers to objects, that is both for class-based and handle-based objects.
Sorry, was that a question, or are you saying this?
No.
So
it is for both.
I believe the safe navigation operator only works for class-based objects, not for handle-based objects, but I could be wrong.
I do think you're wrong.
Okay. we can take a look. But you need to, yeah. So this helps you write a little bit cleaner code in that regard. So that's kind of nifty for these kinds of things where you've got these nested objects. And then the other set of operators that Progress had introduced are if you can skip the next slide, are compound operators. So plus equal 1, plus equals n. They work for all of the operators. They work on all of the data types, which is nifty. So it just makes, again, life a little simpler from that thing. All right. The next big thing, collections have been available or hand-built collections have been available in ABL for a long time. Progress ones were released in the 10s somewhere, I think, or 11, early 11s. The ABL versions, I don't know, Mike, when the Smart Component Library collections were added to the framework, but it would have probably also
around
been
10 to be.
Yeah. So, and collections are great because they combine data and behavior. So you can have data with behavior on it. There's a bunch of standard ones with constraints, sets, lists, maps, dictionaries, those kinds of things. What Progress added in 12.5, which is great, if you could hop to the next slide, was generic collections. And what generic types are basically means, the short of it is you can write common code once and have the compiler help you with making type checks. Generally with a collection, you're going to have objects of one type in them. Temp table-based collections are tricky because you can only define a field as progress lang object. You can't define it as a particular strong type, so you do strong typing there. And so it just makes life, it just adds overhead to your code. You either have to generate code or write a lot of runtime checks. So the generic types let you specify the base code and then say, at runtime, I'm going to add stuff in. So these were added in 12.5. Even though .NET generic types are supported since 10.2a, but they were added in 12.5 and iterated on over the next few releases. Go to the next slide. And so using them, there's kind of this distinction between parameters and arguments. Angle bracket T is for type. You'll see angle bracket K, comma V, key value. It can be anything. I don't think the label matters. T is conventionally your type. K is for key, V is for value. You define a variable. You say there's a list. It's an I list in this case. You say it's of this particular type, country, and you create a static or an implementation, a list in the Progress language. Sorry, the Progress collections namespace. Now, when you add stuff into that, the ISO rules applies and is applied by the compiler, not at runtime. So if you try to add something that's not a country, but that's an animal into this country list, the compiler will say, hang on a second, it doesn't match the ISO rules and you can't do this. So your code doesn't compile. So fewer errors for your users, more errors for you. Which, shift left. The last big one is dynamic data export and import. So handle-based, so new buffer export, buffer import methods on buffer handles let you write generic code or general purpose dump and load code. Previously, it was painful in various forms of pain, and this is really the main reason why the data dictionary requires a developer license, because it uses runtime arguments and not dynamic stuff given when it was written. So again, this is a somewhat special thing. You're not going to do this every day, but when you need this, you're really going to need it. Those are my favorites. Yeah. The other big thing, obviously, as Mike has mentioned, going to 12.8, going to 12.2 is PAS-OE adoption, and that's a big change in a lot of ways. Configuration is one thing, and generally people get the configuration reasonably quickly, right? Once you do it a couple of times, you get the feel for it. But there are changes that need to happen that we see in terms of how you manage things, how you kind of work with instances, and how you deploy them, how you distribute them. So, we land up working with a variety of customers with a variety of setups here. Source code generally doesn't need to change, generally. Web speed may have changes. Certainly, if you've done a lot of tailoring to the webdisk.p, if you have map web objects, there are changes that may be needed. And again, running of the map web objects is supported since 12.6, I believe, maybe 12.7. And again, there's no new generation of that, but yeah. As I say, generally people moving to PaaS, the challenge there becomes initially at least configuration. One of the things I would say is if you're going to move to PaaS, know what your load looks like, know what's happening today before you move to tomorrow. There's too many people that just install the defaults and say, hey, they're good enough for progress, they must be good enough for me. And that doesn't always turn out to be true. And that's something Progress has been saying as well for years. So know what you've got today, know what your throughput is, know what your load on your systems looks like today, and then use that to move into the new PaaS world. The other facet in upgrades, and one of the really nice things that PaaS does give you, is modern identity management. Right? So PaaS itself plugs into or can use OIDC based flows for OAuth 2, SAML, Active Directory, LDAP, LDAP-S, all of those kinds of things really natively plugged in through the Spring framework. One of the things we're finding in a couple of our customers is using a technology called Keycloak, which talks to PaaS over OIDC, so OAuth 2, but itself has good, or maybe better, that's what I'm looking for, technology, better approaches for federating with those single sign-ons across your enterprise. So the integration with a Twitter or a Facebook, not a Twitter, a Facebook or a Google, the integration with Azure, Intranta, I forget its name, it changes often enough, and those kinds of things, and your PaaS to your Keycloak then is always constant and consistent. Your mileage may vary, but it is, it is a really good approach, a really useful approach to take for those kinds of things when, especially in corporate environments, your IT security folk may say, hey, we actually want to change from this to that. And it's fairly simple to do that with the Keycloak approach. Yeah.
Good. Well, then let's look at the other aspect that's really cool about PaaS-OE and PaaS-OE with its Tomcat Foundation and certainly the feature called Web Handlers is really great for building APIs. The classic app server traditionally was built to support ABL GUI applications or TTY applications. It was mainly made to bring certain processing closer to the database. And with the whole design of PaaS-OE, the exposing of APIs to whatever kind of consumer, and especially also XML or JSON-based consumers, is really first-class citizen. With that, that's also what we see is a growing interest in tools, technology standards like Swagger, and things where we supported customers were like integration scenarios where Swagger files, Swagger specifications were key there. So, for instance, you have an in-house built ERP system and you introduce a new, more or less standard warehouse management application. And the warehouse management application provides a Swagger file for the service that it provides for the purpose of integration that can be accessed by the ERP system. But it also provides a Swagger file with the ERP, with the services, with the endpoints it expects the ERP system to provide. and then in that situation, we could use the one Swagger file to generate client components that's ABL code that knows how to talk to the warehouse management system. And the other thing we could provide were PaaS services that implement that Swagger file, and so the warehouse management application knew how to talk to them. And Swagger also provides testing functionality for the developer in a simple to use web page, so that you could see first what data do you need to provide to that warehouse management system, but also you could test whether the service that you expose to the warehouse management system do what you expect them to know. So Swagger, OpenAPI, typically used as synonyms to each other. Swagger is the old name of the specification, but since a couple of years, 8 years, it's actually called OpenAPI. It's the specification, and Swagger is a set of tools that work with that. And it's supported by the typical big players in the IT: Atlassian, Google, IBM, PayPal, SAP, and so on and so on and so on. What a Swagger file, or what many developers recognize as Swagger, is this website tool, where you see a service, you see some description in normal text for humans, and in the bottom you see then a list of endpoints with these colorful bars depending on what HTTP method is used. And this is the Swagger Pet Store. That's like the official sample by the Swagger consortium. And when you then go to one of the endpoints, you can collapse that. Now you can expand it. You see the input data expected by that service. You can run it. You can test run it by putting in then the input data and executing it. You see what it would take to execute it with curl if you want to automate stuff on Linux, but you also see the request URL. You see the data that has been posted and the data that's coming back. Yeah, it's based on a lot JSON schema with some additions to it. Progress provides a Swagger documentation for the OE manager, which allows you to interact with a running PaaS instance. There you also have the file and this website, and from that website you could be checking how many agents are there, how many sessions are on that agent, how much memory do they consume. You could kill an agent, shut an agent down, shut a session gracefully down, and so on and so on. So when we look at what that would mean for a programmer building an API, then we would be seeing, like on the right-hand side, a JSON schema for part of a message. In this case, it's translating to properties of a relatively simple JSON object. As an ABL programmer, I strongly believe that when writing business logic, you should never have to put together a JSON object, because JSON is not strong type. Dealing with JSON is not strong type. So you could misspell your property names, and the other side just wouldn't understand that. And it's even worse because JSON properties are case sensitive. So if you just misspell in the case, so make one of these enabled properties with a lowercase or uppercase e, the other side might not understand it, and that has then severe consequences for the communication. So what other technologies do out of Swagger files is they generate then they generate classes. I mean, as a .NET or Java developer, I would use tooling provided by the Swagger web page to translate a Swagger file into a set of Java or C# classes. This is not available for the ABL. What we've done is we've built tooling to do that. I'm going to show some aspects of that tooling very briefly here. There's a GitHub repository where the bare minimum of the stuff that you need is exposed. We've used that tooling, for instance, in a customer project which is still ongoing, where we integrated with a payment solution from a company called CyberSource out of the Visa enterprises. And that provides a Swagger file which is roughly 110,000 lines of code, JSON file that big. Defines a massive number of endpoints and the message type set. It is based on Swagger 2.0, which is an old standard. We had to convert it to OpenAPI 3.0 because our tooling expects the more recent specification. The converter on the Swagger website failed, but there are tons of conversion utilities on the internet, typically on GitHub or similar websites, so that I could convert that file into OpenAPI 3.0. And that then created me the ABL classes, which we then safely turn into JSON messages for interacting with this service. And for one of these APIs, actually the first one we had to use there, we realized that it was generating 193 ABL classes because the data structure expected there was very nested, many cases in one endpoint. Yeah. So now guess that you have to write all those classes manually, 193 classes manually, following the file. And let's assume it takes you 10 minutes per class. That's 32 hours and 10 minutes. So that's almost a week. And what happens with testing that and code reviewing that, and what when the specification changes, because the truth is that very often these API specifications do change, and then you have to rebuild that all again. So you can't do that manually. You need a tool to work with this if you want to make it efficiently. And when we build code generators like that, we use we like to use an ABL tool that Progress has provided as part of WebSpeed. For the embedded speed script. It is an active template language, very similar to Eclipse chat templates, ASP.NET, etc. And then a template may look like this. And on the other side, we see that it has an ABL loop in this %, going through the properties and then outputting ABL code. So you see down here this defined public property in the bottom. That is actually not a statement as part of the template execution. It's actually ABL code which is generated by the template when it's executed. And then we also generate validation. The Swagger file does provide information about max length for certain properties or whether certain properties are mandatory. So in the types that we generate, we embed the validation based on the Swagger file. We've used that for another customer that needed to query tax rates in the state of California, and the state of California sales tax rates. And apparently the sales tax rates are different by address. They also provide documentation on the web and a Swagger website. They don't use the name Swagger there. They call it their REST API test tool or whatever. But if you look at it and you've seen Swagger before, it is Swagger. So just styles to match their CI. So, and what we can do there is we can limit the code needed to call into that API for an ABL application to you create an instance of the generated client class, and then you call the generated get rate by address class, and you pass in the address as simple character parameters. The false is whatever, I think, whether it returns details or not. And then you get an object as a response. It's an ABL object, so not a JSON object. We convert it into the ABL object, and then you can work with the text rate. If the call fails, it throws an exception, and then exception handling would apply. But with this, we can use Swagger to build code consuming those APIs, which is really consumable by any ABL programmer. So the parts of the tooling that we open sourced are on GitHub, on that address. It's based on the embedded 4GL template engine by Progress, and contains some samples too. In the smart component library, we do have a little bit more comfort on that, and we have the ability to generate clients with all options and service stubs with all options. So we have a schema navigator there where we browse through the schema objects, and then we can generate either just the types or generate a bunch of operations into a client class and so on. Quickly gonna go over that. Otherwise, we'll still be talking at Christmas. And I'll talk a bit about refactoring. We've continued to support customers during refactoring of ABL, TTY, or GUI applications into especially service-oriented logic running on PaaS-OE. Well, that's then always in the context of modernization projects. What is always important to understand at the beginning of modernization project is the why. Very often the UI is the obvious reason why applications are modernized, but it can also be integration scenarios, localization, quality of the code base that customers realize the code is no longer maintainable and they need to do something, etc. Leads into code quality and being prepared for younger developers with the code base as reasons for modernizing. Well, the OpenEdge version upgrade is pushing that too. Then maybe every now and then deprecation of some Progress features. We've seen customers being forced to modernize because Progress does no longer support dynamics on OpenEdge 12. While printing solutions, we recently still met a customer that's using Rapid Builder for reporting, which I think the Rapid Builder runtime is still there, but the designer isn't, and so on. Still customers that go to the App Server for performance reasons, the original reason the App Server was introduced. When we look at building UIs, new UI on top of an ABL application, it is very often then a discussion how much code, especially also code that reacts to what the user does, should still be running on PaaS-OE. So should still PaaS-OE just be doing the core business logic and the transactional processing, or do you want to also try to keep more on PaaS-OE? And I personally believe that in 10 years from now, or I personally expect that in 10 years from now, there will still be OpenEdge as a product, and there will still be an OpenEdge app server similar to PaaS-OE. I'm not saying that it will still be based on Tomcat. I don't know. Maybe in 5 years from now, Tomcat is no longer a state-of-the-art Java app server that is a good choice for Progress to be the underlying infrastructure for PaaS-OE. I just don't know, but I'm pretty sure that Progress will be providing an app server similar enough to the app server that we know now. Like now, we're just facing the switch from classic app server to PaaS-OE, and it is still very similar in the core application runtime. What I do not know, and I don't think anybody can know, what are the front ends, what is the front end technology that people would be using in 10 years from now, because that is changing so often. So with that in mind, during modernization, I always think that we need to keep as much as possible on the ABL side, on the app server, because that is the constant that provides us future-proofness. And that is what actually makes us flexible to switch the UI on top of it. If the UI is really just the minimal bit of the logic, it's looking pretty, it's easy to use, it's the users like to use it. All that must be provided by the UI. But from the functionality of the application, it should really be as thin as possible. That's then the foundation for modernization strategies that we discuss with our customers. Which steps to start with, tackling the whole application, first module there, or some satellites to the whole application, etc. Peter and I have, I think that was already 2 years ago, started defining what we've referred to the OERA maturity model. There are other maturity models out there on REST services, etc. And we just wanted to document what we see as different levels, different stages of implementation. but also different goals for modernization, because we see that there are developer teams that want to go full in with OO and many little service classes, each single purposed, and others believe that with the language like the ABL, you can write better code with larger components than with other languages. And yeah, so we just want to have kind of like some qualification there. And so we describe there 5 different stages of the OERA. And yeah, something you can read about on our blog. And that then leads us also to a way how we can take both during prototyping, but also as a ongoing modernization strategy, what we refer to as a top-down code generalization. At first step, we try to move code, maybe UI trigger code that also reads and updates some data onto the app server. And when it's on the app server through a standardized interface, then the code behind this interface may be pretty still spaghetti kind, can be hundreds or 1,000 lines of code from GUI triggers, but they're already on the app server, and we can put a new pretty front end on top of that. It's a blessing and a curse because people may say this is good enough. So we start from a big UI trigger block, put it behind the service interface, run it as what we refer to as an application service. That's a terminology used in the Onion architecture model, where application services are backend services which are very close to one application or one front end. And then in the second step, we would be isolating the business logic into more the OERA objects, business tasks, for instance. In the next step, we start introducing business entities. And in the last step, we would then be defining, that's not the last step, domains and introduce separation between the functionality between domains or modules. Make sure that they only have well-defined communication passes with each other. And then maybe at the last step, separate business logic and data access in the business entities. So that we actually started from spaghetti code and really built then the more modern, more ideal architectural model, basically like open heart surgery, in steps that are each testable, and you can compare the result of every modernization steps there before and after. And that has just proven to be a good good strategy in certain cases. And that also brings us then to our server-side event handlers. So that's something that we added to the Smart Component Library, beginning of the year. It basically is an event handler running on PaaS-OE, and we can use the same event handler both from our Angular application and desktop applications. And since it's an open API, customers that would be building their own user interface could be very easily plugging to that too. The server-side event handlers, they consume the screen values and update screen values via pro data set. Typically, the screen is getting its data through a business and your business task through pro data sets. So the data, so for other backend components, the data on the screen is represented then through the same pro data set. And then we allow manipulation of the UI state through objects. We can make fields sensitive, insensitive, visible, hidden, change labels, style, control the focus, and so on and so on. We can, from the server, say we need to change the filter on data sources. We can invoke, so return a message that invokes client-side code. We can return messages and questions and pop-up prompts and so on, all from server-side event handlers. So as an example, so this is a method. It gets an event arc which just tells which event occurred to which field in which UI component in which window. We know the session context like user, etc. anyway by context handling, and we get a data set with the screen reels as an input, and we can change the values there. And here I have not yet generalized the data access, so I have left the finds into the customer table because this is now sample following this top-down approach. First one, I get the event handling code on the app server through a standardized interface. And then in the second portion here, I'm assigning in this UI control object a new label to the custom field and a new label to the order date field. The style of the instruction should be error. We're not using the progress color numbers. We say when we do a step forward, we want to refer to style names, which are both understood by .NET controls and all web controls. And we set the focus in the end to that terms field. And that way, it is basically on a line-by-line level, pretty straightforward to translate UI handling code into code that runs on the app server. Good. So now let's look a little bit into the glass bowl. What next year may bring. Still 3 weeks to go, 20 days. I think the more certain thing are the conferences which are being planned. So in March, from what I know so far, the UK and Ireland Progress User Group is making the start with their conference together with Progress Software, March 19th, 20th. In April, there'll be a new PAC, which has a meeting in Lithuania, in Vilnius, on the 9th. We're still organizing, but it's very likely that it will happen in the spring as well, a conference in South Africa, most likely in the Joburg area. I don't know the date yet. The German PAC is doing their conference together with Progress Software on the 13th and 14th of May. And the two large conferences are being planned. The US PAC Challenge in Boston this year next year going to be the first one, October 6th to 8th. And the PAC Challenge in Europe will be in Valencia on November 5th to 7th. At the general session during the PAC Challenge in Prague in September, Antwerp has been announced as the location, but after further consideration, the venue was just not good fit for the conference. So now it's looking like Valencia, and well, we all know there's been heavy flooding in that region in October, but we are 100% convinced that this will not impact the ability to run a conference there. But well, none of these conferences, or most of them, have not been officially announced. I think the German one has been officially announced already. Changes may apply, so don't book your flights yet. Wait for further announcements, but I'm pretty sure that this will be happening. So in the smart component library, well, that's something we can control. I think there'll be more code generation from our UI repository tooling to generate event handler stubs. I think that's one of the last big productivity missing bits for productivity there. I expect that to happen also very early in the year. We have been working for a while on porting our repository UI designer into the web browser using our Angular UI. That will continue next year, and I expect that hopefully mid next year, but definitely before the PAC Challenge conferences, we're able to release that tool. And one thing where I've reserved some time for actually in January, is I want to focus on using either ChatGPT or Codium, but I think for that purpose, ChatGPT offers more flexibility in understanding how close we are to being able to, drop an ABL, TTY, or GUI fed client procedure into such a tool and tell him to spit out, at least skeletons, if not more, of the bits and pieces that would be needed for backend services and front ends. So that's something a bit excited. I don't know. Some days I'm quite enthusiastic about that. Other days I say maybe that needs another year or two. But I think that's gonna be an interesting addition to the code converters, which we are currently doing based on ProParse and ABL code. And with ProParse and ABL code, we just need to code based on what we expect. And AI can be more flexible in adopting expectations to similar use cases. We'll see. We will keep on adding to the smart component library telemetry service. Our telemetry service is, some may say an alternative to Progress's open telemetry offering. I think it's a nice addition to it. The original intention was to collect in a very simple fashion enough details about the requests being made to PaaSOE, to an PaaSOE application, for understanding which requests are executed, how often, how long they take, which parameters they get, etc. To understand basically what's consuming time on your backend. So we'll be adding functionality there, and also tracks and statistics about the PaaSOE runtime, number of agents, number of sessions, memory consumption, etc., that we can see that over time too. One key difference between our telemetry and Progress open telemetry integration, it runs by itself. We are not depending on an open telemetry data collector and stuff like that. We just write to files, and whatever method you have to get the files into your hands to analyze them is up to you, and then we have a graphical tool to dig that. We'll be adding to that graphical tool some UI improvements, storing filters and views and custom columns, etc. We are working on our own dashboard. So far, we've always said, well, if you want to query that, use whatever BI solution. We worked with DataPA to provide a kind of like a reference implementation of a BI dashboard for that. Or we said, well, use Excel and build your charts in Excel, because we can export the data to Excel there. But it looks like there's a demand for a dashboard from us. We'll also be using the telemetry data to provide a test bed for PaaSOE requests. That's a common requirement for developers when you know which AppSer request is causing problems, memory leaks, performance, whatever. Then for further analyzing and fixing stuff, it would always make sense on a developer's life easy to be able to rerun a PaaSOE request in a batch session from a development environment. But for that, you need to understand what are the incoming parameters, what's the session context, what's the client principal, etc. So we'll add functionality to the telemetry toolkit to collect all that data so that we can provide like a runtime that executes your business logic in not 100%, but close to 100% the same environment as the PaaSOE does. We'll also be adopting whatever new language features are coming in OpenEdge 13. We will drop sometime in the second half of the year, probably support for 11.7, maybe in two phases. First, by saying we will not provide new features to the smart component library that where we still maintain compatibility with 11.7. Sometime we will also have to stop providing bug fixes for 11.7. It's just making sure that It runs with 3, soon 4 different Progress versions. It's just a lot of work that we have to do. We're currently supporting 11.7, 12.2, 12.8. Sometime next year, there will be a first version of OpenEdge 13, which would be then the 4th version that we have to support, and that's just not feasible anymore. We will be cleaning up our code base and also from many of the conditional compilation aspects. We still have some conditional compilation for OpenEdge 10 there, and well, we know nobody's using the smart component library no E10 anymore, so we will be making an effort to clean that up. So, and there are a couple of aspects in coming from Progress that we're looking for, and yeah, so this is my personal expectation. I mean, discussed it with Peter, and we're pretty sure that these things will probably come. Whether they come in 13.0, 1.2, whatever, or ever, we just don't know. We're just basing this on attendance of Progress Software roadmap presentations. And well, so we may have misunderstood it there, and Progress may change their plans at any time without any announcement. So really take this with care. But I think the things which are pretty certain to come in an innovator release. First, I expect that there will be an innovator release 13.0 in the second half of next year. And I expect to see then features like the OpenEdge memory profiler and some ABL enhancements. The memory profiler, that's going to be a snapshot-based tool that analyzes the memory used by an ABL virtual machine, by the ABL runtime. So giving us insight into handle-based objects, class-based objects. You may say, yeah, but we can do that already now with the dynamic objects tracking. Yes, but I expect to see more details, and I expect to see more usability. I expect to see more about the startup parameters and memory-related startup parameters and how much of those are used. So how much of your MX is used, how much of your -D is used, and reusable objects, how much memory does it consume, etc. Right now, when using -D and -reusable objects to tune an OABL application, you can just try out. You can just play with these parameters, increase them in big steps because small steps usually don't bring anything. You can try to see whether it improves the performance, and you can see how much it impacts the total memory of your Progress process. But seeing really what's used by -D and how efficient that is just not possible. I expect that there will be a program API, so either a built-in object or a handle-based object similar to the profiler handle or the debugger handle that we can use to take a snapshot when we think it's useful in our code. And I think on the feature side of the memory profiler, Progress has told a lot at the PAC challenges this fall. So Sunil Jardosh from Progress Development has given a presentation on the memory profiler with the expected features. That slide deck is available on the website of the PAC challenge. From Proginov, a French-based Progress partner, Adrien Fraisse, I hope I didn't get the name totally wrong, and Patrice Prérault have given a presentation how they're using that feature already today, because the memory profiler is an undocumented, the component that tracks the memory usage is an undocumented feature already in 12.8. I mean, that may change in 13.0. What Progress has not yet provided is a front end to analyze this data. And so Progenov has built their own front end for that. And so there are 2 presentations available on the PAC Challenge website, at least in the Prague download section, where you can get an idea about how Progenov uses this feature, and from Sunil, what Progress is intending there. Progress has had at many roadmap sessions and talked about the addition of better support for annotations in the ABL. Generally, there are annotations in the language since OpenEdge 10. I don't know whether they've been in 9, but I mean, that's historic. What annotations do is they provide instructions to tools how to deal with the code at runtime. One example are the add test annotations that are used at Able Unit, or the annotations for the REST service that you can put together with Progress Developer Studio. But as of today, there's no tooling available to use annotations at runtime. In the smart component layer, we've built our own tooling, which is because we wanted to use them. I mean, annotation are part of the language, and in any other modern development environment, C#, Java, TypeScript, annotations have so many use cases for developers that we need to use them. So that's an example how we expose a class-based method as a full-fledged RESTful service. We had an annotation describing the thing, and the rest happens magically at runtime. There's no deployment for the REST service needed. You just put the R code and a JSON file that is the result of these annotations into a running PathOE, and that's it. So what I expect is that in some OpenEdge 13 release, progress will improve the support for annotations. And based on that, we can roll back parts of our own tooling there. Right now, once our annotation tooling is configured, it typically just runs and nobody needs to care about it, but the setting up requires building some ANT files, which are executed in PDSOE of VS Code. But with an out-of-the-box features with Progress, I expect that to be no longer needed. And I also expect that the tooling support in VS Code or PDSE improves with more focus on annotations. So the other thing that I really hope for are generic types. Peter has, so Peter, now I say Progress when I mean Peter. That's giving a deep shadow on you. Generic types, Peter has spoken about them in the context of the lists and sets that Progress has introduced over the innovator releases between 12.2 and 12.8. Progress supports generic types for .NET classes since whatever version 10, 10.2a, 10.2b. So what we expect, and it's again based on statements made at the roadmaps presentations, is that we will be able to build generic types for our own Able classes. And that will allow us to remove our include file-based pseudo generic types. We have a couple of constructs where we're doing that, also our own lists, and but also in our own mapper, we're generating a lot of code that would not be needed when we would have access to the user-defined generic types. So my expectation is if we remove the need to generate source code which needs to be compiled, the amount of files that needs to be compiled will be reduced quite significantly. There will be less R code around, so the memory footprint of the application will go down. And again, I expect that this will also have a positive impact on developer tooling. And with this, I would like to end this webinar. Well, open this up for discussion. Wish you all a happy holiday season, and well, hopefully see each other next year. We will very likely continue with these webinars in the spring.